Hey everybody, hope you guys are doing alright. Sorry, my throat's a little... Anyway, there's a book, a little bit of a book I want to share with you guys. It's called From Return from Tomorrow. I've shared a little bit of this book with you guys. It's written by G Ritchie with Elizabeth Sherrill. And it's a book based on a person's real experience in, I think, World War II. Yeah, World War II. And it's really his testimony and his walk with Jesus. And it's got some really beautiful stuff to share. And so I want to share it with you guys today. So here we go. This is towards the end of the book, but this particular part I just really want to share with whoever hears it, I guess. All right, so I'm just gonna read, and you guys get what you get. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the 123rd evac entered Germany with the occupying troops. I was part of a group assigned to a concentration camp near Wuppertal, charged with getting medical help to the newly liberated prisoners, many of them Jews from Holland, France, and Eastern Europe. This was the most shattering experience I had yet had. I had been exposed many times by then to sudden death and injury, but to see the effects of slow starvation, to walk through those barracks where thousands of men had died a little bit at a time over a period of years, was a new kind of horror. For many, it was an irreversible process. We lost scores each day in spite of all the medicine and food we could rush to them. Now I needed my new insight indeed. When the ugliness became too great to handle, I did what I had learned to do. I went from one end to the other of that barbed wire enclosure, looking into men's faces until I saw looking back at me the face of Christ. And that's how I came to know Wild Bill Cody. That wasn't his real name. His real name was 7 unpronounceable syllables in Polish, but he had long, drooping, handlebar mustaches like pictures of an old Western hero, so the American soldiers called him Wild Bill. He was one of the inmates of the concentration camp, but obviously he hadn't been there long. His posture was erect, his eyes bright, his energy indefatigable. Since he was fluent in English, French, German, and Russian, as well as Polish, he became a kind of unofficial camp translator. We came to him with all sorts of problems. The paperwork alone was staggering in attempting to relocate people whose families, even whole hometowns, might have disappeared. But though Wild Bill worked 15 and 16 hours a day, he showed no signs of weariness. While the rest of us were drooping with fatigue, he seemed to gain strength. We have time for this old fellow, he'd say. He's been waiting to see us all day. His compassion for his fellow prisoners glowed on his face, and it was to this glow that I came when my own spirits were low. So I was astonished to learn when Wild Bill's own papers came before us one day that he had been in Wuppertal since 1939. For 6 years he had lived on the same starvation diet, slept in the same airless and disease-ridden barracks as everyone else, but without the least physical or mental deterioration. Perhaps even more amazing, every group in the camp looked on him as a friend. He was the one to whom quarrels between inmates were brought for aberration. Only after I'd been at Wuppertal a number of weeks did I realize what a rarity this was in a compound where the different nationalities of prisoners hated each other almost as much as they did the Germans. As for Germans, feeling against them ran so high that in some of the camps liberated earlier, former prisoners had seized guns, run into the nearest village, and simply shot the first Germans they saw. Part of our instructions were to prevent this kind of thing, and again, Wild Bill was our greatest asset, reasoning with the different groups, counseling forgiveness. It's not easy for some of them to forgive, I commented to him one day as we sat over mugs of tea in the processing center. So many of them have lost members of their families. Wild Bill leaned back in the upright chair and sipped at his drink. We lived in the Jewish section of Warsaw, he began slowly. The first words I heard him speak about himself. My wife, our 2 daughters, and our 3 little boys. When the Germans reached our street, they lined everyone against a wall and opened up with machine guns. I begged to be allowed to die with my family, but because I spoke German, they put me in a work group. He paused, perhaps seeing again his wife and 5 children. I had to decide right then, he continued, whether to let myself let myself hate the soldiers who had done this. It was an easy decision, really. I was a lawyer. In my practice, I had seen too often what hate could do to people's minds and bodies. Hate had just killed the 6 people who mattered most to me in the world. I decided then that I would spend the rest of my life, whether it was a few days or many years, loving every person I came in contact with. Loving every person. This was the power that had kept a man well in the face of every privation. It was the power I had first met in a hospital room in Texas and was learning little by little to recognize wherever he chose to shine through, whether the human vehicle was aware of him or not. I returned to the States from occupation duty in Germany in the spring of 1946, and Margaret and I were married the following year. When the moment came to tell her about the Texas experience, it happened as if it had the 2 previous times, naturally, almost effortlessly on my part, helping the love between us grow. Meanwhile, Jack Helm's hunch had proved correct. The administrator who had sworn to keep me out of there was no longer connected with the Medical College of Virginia. The man who went to bat to get me readmitted was Dr. Sidney Negus, the professor who had given me the D in biochemistry. This time I was determined not to make the mistake I had made before. My trouble began, I saw now, when I took my eyes off of Jesus and onto myself. This time I didn't worry about my stupidity or my poor record, and I got through school without difficulty. From the outset of my career, however, I discovered what all doctors know. Medicine does not have all the answers. When stumped, as I often was, I would pray for my patient, silently, under my breath, asking Jesus' help in making the right diagnosis, prescribing the right treatment. In addition, Margaret and I formed the habit of praying together for patients every morning. I continued to read the Bible. It was funny. In Sunday school, the Bible had seemed to me both boring and difficult. Since Texas, it had become simply a factual description of life. When Jesus said to some fishermen on a lakeside, "Follow me," of course they dropped everything and hurried after him. Who could resist? When he said, "I am the light of the world," it was simply an observable fact. But if my experience made the Bible comprehensible, much more so as I now began to read it systematically after the war, it was the Bible which helped me understand the experience. Reading over and over the accounts of the crucifixion, I understood at last where that certainty had come from. In his presence, that I was not condemned, in spite of the ugly actions I had committed, which were paraded in the plain view before us. It was his death I came to see that had already paid for these things, the light of his resurrection in which we stood. Why these cosmic acts should have applied to me, whether I could somehow have appropriated them in that church service at age 11, I didn't know, but I began to understand, reading the Bible, how all-important our lives on this earth are in his plan, how terribly wrong I had been on the SS Brazil at St. Valerie and Rethel to detest mine, to ask him to take me out of this world before his work in me was done. I thought of the wretched souls I had seen in that first post-earthly realm, trapped in hatreds and lusts, fixed on material things forever out of reach. Somehow none of them had finished growing up in their time on earth, whether it had been long or short. I had no trouble believing that some of the teenagers I had seen blown to bits in Europe had accomplished already the goals God had for them on earth, were well prepared to graduate to some sphere nearer him. But I certainly had not been. With my self-centeredness, my prejudices, my self-righteousness, how had I dared ask to die? In yearning for Jesus, I had forgot what he showed me, that plain crawling that plain crawling with the unhappiest beings I had ever seen, each insisting on his own superiority to the annihilation of everybody else, had I seriously wanted an eternity in some existence like this? Would I ever, in fact, reach the point where I'd be willing to say, on my own, I've done what I'm supposed to do on Earth? Alright, I love you guys. Hope you have a good day. Bye.